Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to be talking about what the best method is to determine your type. So this is not going to be an exclusively INFJ video. I'm just going to be surveying different methods for identifying type, and I'll also be offering what you might call a preliminary assessment of which one I think is the worst, which one I think is the best, and which ones are in the middle. And before I move on, remember that I've written a book on the INFJ type. It's called The Ecstatic Soul. It's available at all the Amazon links down below in the description box, all the countries. If you're encountering any issue, if you don't find your country, just please drop me a line or an email and I'll be happy to answer you. My email is in the About section of my channel page. It's very in-depth investigation of the INFJ kind of consciousness if you want to go deeper. If you have a broad understanding of the function stack of the INFJ and you've read the literature online but you want to go deeper, get to a more existential philosophical sense of what it means to be INFJ, challenges, existential satisfactions, fulfillment, and so on, this is the book to get. Right, so most of you will probably be aware that there are plenty of different ways of seeking to identify what type you are. I mean, I suspect that many of you have used various methods to arrive at the conclusion that you are, for instance, INFJ, maybe INTP, maybe INTJ, maybe ENFP. There are different types in my audience. What are those methods? By what methods can you arrive at a determination of your type? The most obvious one, and probably the most common if you take population as a whole, not just population on YouTube, is by far the test. Most popular being the 16 personalities test, but there's a plethora of other tests that are devised. Let me just mention that Eric Thor on his website also has a test, which is pretty good, so you can check that out. But that's by far the most common method. Now, the second method is to read up on the cognitive functions, description of the cognitive functions, and try to figure out which one you resonate with the most. You draw a hierarchy of what you resonate with the most, and then you compare that hierarchy with the standard hierarchies corresponding to each one of the 16 types. And on the basis of the correlation, basically decide that you identify with the type whose hierarchy is closest to the hierarchy you arrived at. So for example, your hierarchy could be NITI-FE, something like that, SE, and you could then sort of go for INFJ. Okay, and now a third method is to be typed by a professional, or at least be typed by an expert, either professional expert or self-defined expert. I don't mean this in a pejorative way. So you could go and get coaching, Again, there's plenty of names that I've mentioned in recent videos. C.S. Joseph, talking with famous people, cognitive type, although they do it slightly differently, as we'll see. You can get it done by Harry CPD, Harry Murrell, and many other people, Eric Thor as well. So that's essentially objective personality, casual cognition. That's essentially trusting an external party to give you an assessment of your type. Now, I'll move on to the last one before I proceed to sort of unpack what's good and what's bad about each of these approaches. Now, the last one is what I would call linguistic analysis. It's not as common, at least in terms of formal methods, but it's practiced by a lot of people in an informal sense, as part of communities, on forums, on YouTube, on the personality database website, essentially looking at a piece of writing and identifying what cognitive functions are exemplified in a piece of writing. Could also be a piece of speech, but it's not really about the micro expressions, or at least the micro expressions are very much in the background. Maybe they're tiny parameters or small parameters, but they're not primary. What matters is an analysis of the content of the utterances of people, whether written or spoken. Okay, so number one, the tests. It's common knowledge that 16 personalities is not a really good test. There are better tests out there. However, tests are always going to be hampered by a certain number of built-in weaknesses. I would call them that. So there's obviously the implicit bias of the person who will answer questions, will have difficulty answering questions exactly as things are, but also as they wish them to be. Compounding that is the fact that sometimes people don't introspect enough, or don't introspect in all the varied ways necessary for giving an honest answer, even if they are actually willing to be as honest as they can, so they can be wrong on that front. And I would say that finally, and maybe one of the more egregious problems with tests is that it's very difficult to phrase particular questions as knowledge judgments rather than as value judgments. So this is a bit of a technical point, but a typical example on 16 personalities is this. They'll ask you, I'd rather my child grew up smart than kind. And you have a range of options from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Well, the thing is, it's meant to measure whether you're more an F or a T type. You see, it's supposed to be a knowledge judgment to get a better knowledge of you, but it really sounds like it's a value judgment. And the problem with value judgments is that they are not actually at all captured by the Jungian cognitive functions. Value judgments, like two types could have similar value judgments and be completely opposite. In other words, you could wish your child were kind rather than smart, were you a T or an F, or the reverse. So there's no incidence whatsoever. So it's very difficult to avoid phrasing what are supposed to be knowledge judgments in terms of value judgments. So that's a big issue. So actually on that basis, I would say the test does not fare. It's the most common, it's the handiest, it's the most popular, it's kind of funny, it has a bit of a horoscope kind of attractiveness to it, but I would say it's one of the less reliable methods to get your type right. Now, reading up on the cognitive functions is a pretty good approach, because first of all, when you read up on the cognitive functions, you read descriptions of cognitive functions. So the main challenge to be able to understand the way that they are described, you might need to get a little bit of time to get used to it. Maybe reading a bit of Jung prior to that would be helpful as well, to get a better grasp of what NI is and what he means by intuition and what he means by introversion, what he means by thinking and so on. But once you get that sorted out, to actually manage to sort of identify which one you relate with more, I think it's because here there's no value judgments, it's all purely knowledge judgment. They're purely descriptive paragraphs on what functions are like. There's no suggestion of a preference, or this function is better or worse or whatever. You're not stuck in these paradoxes, so there's not as much of a leap to make in order to be able to identify which functions you relate to the most. So that's very good, and also it has the advantage of giving you a precise description of what the cognitive functions are. So you have a direct contact with the actual cognitive makeup that you may or may not have, rather than descriptions that are meant, like as in tests, to be more accessible, but at the same time they're also vaguer, they're much more susceptible to cognitive bias and so on and so forth. The difficulty with this particular approach is, again, you probably need to be fairly fluent in typological literature in the first place. A lot of people will think, well, that's not true, it's easy to read on the functions, but they probably don't realize that it's probably because they got to a level already that is quite advanced compared to the average person. It's actually not easy to get to a stage where you can be like, yeah, I know exactly how NI would be described, or FE or TE. It takes some reading, and some people will not be willing to make that effort. And also another smaller weakness is that it might not be easy for people to move from like identifying which functions they agree with the most to which type they are, because they might hesitate between two functions. They might they might not be sure if they're more NI or FE, for example. So the burden of making the choice of what type you are falls back on you in a way. You need to go all the way and make that decision, and it can be difficult for some people. The test in a way saves you that, because it gives you the answer. And the third category, which I want to discuss now, also saves you that, because then you entrust an external expert to do that for you. So what about that third possibility? Well, in the case of that third possibility, I would say it very much depends on the expert that you're relying on, because the expert needs to have a certain number of virtues. So one of the virtues obviously is to be competent, to have a good knowledge of the cognitive functions. And they need to have a clear method that they follow and that they're able to transparently justify to the other person as the tool that they're using. Because if they don't have this method, then what are they basing themselves on? Like the person they're talking to, the client, will not be able to not envisage possibility they're just making it up, or they're just, finding stuff to say as they go along. So they need a clear framework. And the problem with a clear framework is that in general, it tends to be limiting, and it tends to be biased by the expert's own biases. So it's probably better, if you're going to focus on Jungian cognitive functions, to stick to Myers-Briggs, more or less, like Azure Psych does, for example, rather than trying to just come up with some new definitions for types and terms, where you could be transported very far away from the original Jungian meanings, and you might not know this. You'll just hear a type that sounds familiar, and you'll think that that's your type in the way Jung imagined it, and it's not the case. So we have to be careful when it comes to that. Now, another big problem that I mentioned before is that these experts usually have a financial interest in typing you, which means that they actually sometimes they can make a living out of it, or at least they make money, part of a living out of it. So they have a professional interest, they have a financial interest in giving you a type. And what is the problem here? Well, the problem here is that they will never, it's very unlikely that they'll say at the end of the session, can't make a decision on your type. The information you provided it, we've had exchanges and so on and so forth, but I still cannot decide. In fact, that ought to be very common if the typist is honest, because a lot of people are very complex, and it's not easy through conversations and assessments to get to a definition of type. But if the typist were to do this, they imagine the reputation would suffer. People will be like, well, I paid X amount of dollars to not even get an answer, and that would be frustrating. So typists have a vested interest in providing an answer even when they're not sure about their answer, and that's obviously a problem because the risk of mistyping increases. Now, I think that there are some typing services where what they can do is tell you, okay, on the basis of our answers, we are 85%, whatever the means they use to get there, to get to these approximations. 85% INFJ, 70% INFP, 55% INTP, something like that. That's actually quite good, because they're not committing to a particular type, but they're giving you the likelihoods whilst acknowledging that complete certainty would be, in a way, lying to you, masquerading. So I think some typing services do this. I would say that's usually a sign that they're trying to be as honest as they can be, whilst having to fulfill the needs of the financial demands that are placed on them based on the tough competition around there now for people providing typing services. Now, there is a number of other issues with typists. I would say that with voltology, typing based on microexpressions, I would say, as much as I think it's an interesting approach, you can get typed by a voltologist. I'm not saying you should not do it. It's an interesting approach, but I would recommend that if you can afford it, to get typed by a more traditional typist as well, and see if the two descriptions correspond, because voltology uses a method that is purely physiological. They would claim otherwise, but essentially they're looking at your physique and your expressions. The assumption is that your psyche determines your expressions. It's an assumption, and I'm not sure that the evidence is sufficient to claim that it's perfectly reliable, so try to get it cross-checked. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Eric Thor, that is often typed as an ENFP by voltologists. And knowing Eric personally and interacting with him, it got me thinking, is he an ENFP? Like, I did consider that. But, I mean, I've talked to him many times and I've interacted with him, and I don't see a lot of ENFP-ness there. TI seems quite present, and FE seems quite present as well. It's just for a little remark. So, I think voltology needs to progress a bit more before it can be completely trusted on its own. Finally, the method that I would personally trust the most is linguistic analysis. What I would say is in terms of my rankings after linguistic analysis, I would say number 2, cognitive functions, reading up on the cognitive functions. Number 3, third best, getting typed by an expert. And number 4, the tests. Okay, so you have number 1, the linguistic analysis. Number 2, reading up on the functions qualitatively and comparing with what you relate the most to. Number 3, getting typed by an expert. And 4, linguistic analysis. Linguistic analysis is literally looking at the contents and the structure of what you say. Because unlike what Voltology says, Voltology claims that the advantage of typing by micro-expressions is that you cannot fake your micro-expressions. In some sense, this is quite true. But the Voltologist is very much open to mistaking micro-expressions, and that's not often acknowledged enough, and I think that in terms of the checks and balances, they're not clear enough at this point. But people also cannot really have any control over how they say things, okay? They might have control over what they say. So, obviously, someone asks you questions. Someone asks you a question. They ask you, about your background, let's say. You can lie about your background. You can say the truth. So obviously you have control to some extent over the content of what you say. But the way in which you're going to describe yourself, the way in which you're going to bring elements of the past to enrich the picture, the way in which you're going to refer to other people and talk about ideas and talk about concrete facts and talk about the future, make value judgments, make knowledge judgments, all these different ways. Like what you decide to talk about, you have control over it. You can be truthful, not truthful, and so on and so forth. You can control the emphasis you put on certain things. You can use rhetoric, but the actual structure, how you say things, is something that you have very little control over. I have very little control over myself. And I think that's because language is very, very deeply imbricated with mind. Mind and language have a very, very deep connection. In a way, language is woven through mind, or mind is woven through language. And so I think that there's a very deep connection between our psychical apparatuses and the way in which the structure of our utterances is expressed. And based on my experience, that I'm usually in a position to say that particular way of talking suggests strong NE, that particular way of talking suggests strong FI, or FI somewhere, FE, NI, TI. I mean, I would argue that NE and TI are among the most recognizable, actually, and SE as well. But really, you can apply that to all the functions. And on the basis of that, you can also figure out extroversion versus introversion, linguistic analysis of statements. Statements are objective. They're out there. In a sense, they're measurable if you specify your methods, and you can break them down and show patterns of function use, and it's also repeatable, and you can observe later ways of talking by the same person and examine the same patterns. So there is a possibility for iterative observations. So really, like, we're talking about something that probably has the potential to qualify as science. I've been trying to develop a new system, functionalism, to exploit that, and I've hit a roadblock with regard to FI, to be completely honest. Not in general, but in some of the more specific aspects of how to justify the theory. But linguistic analysis is really where I see the future, and hopefully I can lead the way, but we'll have to see. Anyway, it's been a long video, so I wanted to just list those 4 approaches, and I would love to hear what you think in the comments, guys. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Consider giving me a like, subscribing, and commenting, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.